Dust swirled around the arriving stagecoach as Henrietta stepped onto the unforgiving Wyoming dirt. Weighing nearly 300 pounds, she carried a single valise and a desperate secret. The towering rancher looked her up and down with utter disdain. "You'll sleep in the barn," he spat. He had no idea she was about to become his salvation. The year was 1883, and the wind howling through the jagged peaks of the Wind River Range carried the bitter promise of an early winter. The Broken Anvil Ranch sat in the shadow of those mountains, a sprawling but dying expanse of land owned by Jedediah McAllister. Jedediah was a man carved from the very granite of the territory, broad-shouldered, heavily bearded, and hardened by years of loss and back-breaking labor. He had placed an advertisement in a St. Louis newspaper requesting a sturdy, resilient housekeeper and cook capable of managing a rough crew and surviving the harsh frontier. He had expected a hardened frontier widow. He had expected muscle and grit. Instead, the stagecoach had dropped off Henrietta Coulter. Henrietta, known as Hattie to the few who cared to ask, stood in the middle of the dusty ranch yard, the harsh autumn sun beating down on her heavy wool dress. She was an obese woman, her body carrying the physical weight of a sedentary life back in Philadelphia, a life she had fled when her father's mercantile business collapsed in a scandal that had left her penniless and socially ruined. She had spent her last dime on the stagecoach ticket west, armed with nothing but a leather valise, a prized cast-iron Dutch oven wrapped in a quilt, and an iron will to survive. Jedediah stood on the porch of the main house, his thumbs hooked into his suspenders, his eyes narrowed in a mixture of disbelief and immediate regret. He walked down the wooden steps, his boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't offer a hand to help her with her heavy bags. "You're the Coulter woman," Jedediah said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the cold air. It wasn't a question. "I am Mr. McAllister," Hattie replied. Her voice was steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was acutely aware of how she looked to him, out of place, cumbersome, a liability in a land that killed the weak without a second thought. Jedediah shook his head, looking past her toward the horizon, as if hoping another, more suitable woman would magically appear on the trail. "The agency made a mistake. Or, you lied in your letters. I need someone who can haul water, chop firewood, and feed 15 men before the sun comes up. I ain't running a boarding house for city folk who can't carry their own weight." The cruelty in his words was casual, born of exhaustion rather than pure malice, but it stung all the same. Hattie's jaw tightened. She had endured the sneers of Philadelphia high society, the whispers behind fans about her size, and the outright cruelty of her creditors. She was not going to be broken by a mountain man in a dirt-stained shirt. "I assure you, Mr. McAllister, I am capable of hard work," Hattie said, lifting her chin. "If you show me the kitchen is a mess. And the crew is worse," Jedediah interrupted, cutting her off. He rubbed the back of his neck, his frustration palpable. He looked at her again, his eyes lingering on her heavy frame, calculating how quickly she would break. "There ain't a stage back to Laramie for 3 weeks. You can stay till then, but I ain't putting you up in the main house. I don't trust strangers, and I ain't got the time to babysit." He pointed a thick, calloused finger toward a massive, weathered structure at the edge of the property. "You'll sleep in the barn. There's an empty tack room in the back. Keep out of the way, and I'll pay your fare back east when the time comes." He turned his back on her and walked away, dismissing her entirely. Hattie stood alone in the howling wind. A lesser woman might have sat in the dirt and wept. Instead, Hattie picked up her heavy valise in one hand and her quilted cast-iron pot in the other. She walked toward the barn. The interior of the barn was dim, smelling strongly of old hay, horse sweat, and leather. The tack room Jedediah had mentioned was nothing more than a small, drafty enclosure with a dirt floor, a cot made of stretched canvas, and a single, cracked window. A massive draft horse named Goliath occupied the stall next door, snorting as she entered. Hattie set her bags down. Her legs ached from the weeks of travel, and her chest heaved with the effort of carrying her belongings. She sat heavily on the canvas cot, which creaked dangerously in protest but held. She took a deep breath, the cold air burning her lungs. "Well, Goliath," Hattie whispered to the horse through the wooden slats, "it seems we are roommates." She unpacked her few belongings. She didn't cry. Crying didn't cook meals, and it certainly didn't change the minds of stubborn men. As the evening set in, Hattie stepped out of the barn to observe the ranch. The men, a ragtag group of cowboys looking more like ghosts than workers, were gathered around a roaring fire near the dilapidated cookhouse. Hattie watched them quietly. They were eating what looked like boiled navy beans and hardtack, washing it down with coffee that smelled like burnt mud. The morale was abysmal. She overheard a wiry older cowboy named Thaddeus complaining about a missing calf, while a younger boy named Wyatt looked like he was one cold night away from deserting. Looming over them was Amos Gentry, the ranch foreman. Gentry was a slick, sharp-featured man who carried a coiled whip and a constant sneer. Hattie watched him closely. There was something inherently untrustworthy about the way he moved, like a coyote circling a dying calf. Gentry barked orders at the men, kicking dirt into the fire before retreating to the warmth of the bunkhouse, leaving the crew in the freezing dark. The Broken Anvil was a ranch on the brink of collapse. Hattie could see it in the sunken eyes of the men, the fraying ropes, the neglected fences, and the bitter hostility of its owner. Jedediah McAllister thought she was useless. He thought her size made her weak. But Hattie knew something about survival that the mountain man didn't. Survival wasn't just about hauling logs or breaking horses. It was about sustaining the soul, and Hattie knew exactly how to do that. Tomorrow, the Broken Anvil was going to wake up to a revolution. Hattie awoke at 3 a.m. The Wyoming cold had seeped through the thin walls of the tack room, settling deep into her bones. But she forced herself up. She dressed quickly in the dark, tying a heavy canvas apron over her dress. She grabbed her Dutch oven and marched across the frosty yard toward the cookhouse. The kitchen was a disaster. It was a chaotic mess of grease-stained wood, unwashed tin plates, and a massive rusted cast-iron stove that looked as though it hadn't been properly cleaned in a decade. Mice scurried into the corners as she lit a single kerosene lantern. Hattie tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. Despite her weight, Hattie possessed an unexpected grace and stamina in a kitchen. Back in Philadelphia, while her peers attended galas, she had spent her time in the kitchens of her father's grand house, learning the secrets of French chefs and Southern cooks alike. When the money ran out, she had kept herself and her father alive by stretching meager rations into feasts. First, she tackled the stove, scrubbing the rust and built-up grease with coarse salt and a rag. Then, she built a fire. Not a smoky, hesitant flame, but a roaring, perfectly oxygenated fire that immediately began to heat the freezing room. She took an inventory of the pantry. It was dismal. Sacks of flour, a barrel of salted pork, wild onions, molasses, and stale coffee beans. To the untrained eye, it was poverty. To Hattie, it was a canvas. She started with the coffee. She didn't just boil the stale beans, she crushed them fine, roasted them briefly in a dry skillet to coax out the remaining oils, and brewed them with a pinch of salt to kill the bitterness, adding a tiny drop of molasses for depth. Next, the biscuits. Hattie didn't rely on the dubious baking powder in the tin. She mixed flour, rendered pork fat, and a splash of sour milk she found in the icebox, kneading the dough with practiced rhythmic motions. Her large hands moved with incredible speed and precision. She cut the dough and placed the biscuits into her prized Dutch oven, setting it right onto the hot coals. For the main course, she soaked the salted pork in warm water to draw out the harsh brine, then fried it in thick steaks. With the leftover grease, the wild onions, and a handful of flour, she built a rich, peppery sawmill gravy that soon bubbled and thickened, filling the cookhouse with an aroma so intoxicating it seemed to defy the bleakness of the territory. By 5 o'clock, the sun was just beginning to peek over the jagged mountains, casting a pale, bruised light across the ranch. The first cowboy to enter the cookhouse was Wyatt, the young greenhorn. He pushed open the door, his eyes bleary, shivering in his worn coat. He stopped dead in his tracks. The overwhelming smell of fresh, buttery biscuits, sizzling meat, and rich coffee hit him like a physical blow. "Lord Almighty," Wyatt whispered, taking off his hat. Thaddeus followed close behind, his boots dragging until he crossed the threshold. The old Civil War veteran's eyes widened. Soon, the entire crew of 15 men was crowded into the small dining area, staring in stunned silence at the feast laid out before them. "Sit down," Hattie ordered. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a maternal authority that none of them dared challenge. They ate like starving wolves. There was no talking, only the clatter of tin forks and the sounds of men tasting real food for the first time in months. The biscuits were flaky and light, soaking up the savory, thick gravy. The coffee was strong and smooth, warming them from the inside out. Jedediah McAllister walked in 10 minutes later. He stopped in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the morning light. He looked at his men, who were usually grumbling and cursing at this hour, now sitting in contented, reverent silence. Then he looked at Hattie, who was wiping down the counter, her face flushed from the heat of the stove, but her posture entirely unbothered. Without a word, Jedediah grabbed a tin plate. He scooped up 2 biscuits, poured a generous ladle of gravy, and took a sip of the coffee. Hattie watched him from the corner of her eye. She saw the exact moment the flavors registered. Jedediah's rugged face softened for a fraction of a second, his eyes closing briefly as the hot, rich food hit his empty stomach. But just as quickly, the hardened mountain man returned. He ate, standing up, set his plate down, and walked out without a word of thanks. But Hattie didn't need his thanks. She had seen the truth. Over the next 2 weeks, the dynamic on the Broken Anvil began to shift. The men, fueled by Hattie's incredible cooking, worked with a newfound vigor. Fences that had been broken for months were suddenly mended. Sick calves were tended to. When Wyatt fell ill with a fever, Hattie brewed a tea of willow bark and wild mint, forcing it down his throat until his fever broke. She became the undisputed queen of the cookhouse. The cowboys treated her with a fierce, protective reverence. They chopped her wood without being asked. Old Thaddeus brought her wild berries he found on the ridges. They didn't see an obese city woman. They saw the heart of their home. Yet, as the ranch's internal spirit healed, external pressures tightened like a noose. Hattie began to notice the shadows creeping over the Broken Anvil. She heard the men talking in hushed tones about Bartholomew Finch, a ruthless cattle baron from Cheyenne. Finch was buying up every struggling ranch in the Wind River Valley, desperate to secure the water rights along Bitter Creek. She also noticed Amos Gentry. The foreman despised Hattie. Her presence had boosted morale, making the men less compliant to his bullying. More than that, Hattie's sharp eyes caught things others missed. She noticed that the supplies arriving by wagon didn't match the volume the men were consuming. She noticed Gentry taking long rides toward the eastern ridge Finch's territory when he was supposed to be checking the northern fence lines. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon. Hattie was in the main house, tasked by Jedediah to clean out his dilapidated study. While dusting the heavy oak desk, she found a leather-bound ledger left carelessly open. Numbers were Hattie's first language. Before the scandal, she had managed the sprawling accounts of her father's mercantile empire. She understood profit margins, deficits, and, most importantly, discrepancies. Setting her duster aside, Hattie pulled the ledger closer. She traced her plump finger down the columns of ink. Her breath hitched. The numbers were entirely fabricated. The price listed for grain was double the going rate in Laramie. The head count of cattle sold to the railhead in Cheyenne was significantly lower than what Hattie had heard the men boasting about rounding up. Someone was bleeding Jedediah McAllister dry, skimming the profits and doctoring the books. And based on the handwriting, which matched the supply requisitions Hattie had seen in the kitchen, that someone was Amos Gentry. Hattie realized with a cold dread that Gentry wasn't just a bad foreman. He was a mole. He was actively sabotaging the Broken Anvil from the inside, softening it up for Bartholomew Finch to buy for pennies. She had to tell Jedediah, but as she looked out the window toward the darkening sky, she wondered, would the stubborn mountain man believe the overweight woman he forced to sleep in the barn, or the foreman he had trusted for 5 years? The Wyoming sky turned the color of an iron skillet as a violent autumn thunderstorm rolled over the Wind River Range. Rain lashed against the wooden siding of the main house in heavy, driving sheets. Inside the study, the air was thick with tension. Jedediah stood by the window, watching the storm, his massive shoulders tense. Hattie sat across from his desk, the open ledger resting between them. "You're out of your mind, woman," Jedediah growled, not turning around. "Gentry has ridden with me since my brother died. He pulled me out of a blizzard in '79. He ain't a thief." "The numbers do not lie, Mr. McAllister," Hattie said, her voice completely steady, rising just enough to be heard over the thunder. She didn't cower. "I manage the accounts of one of the largest shipping firms in Philadelphia. Look at the ledger. On September 4th, he lists 50 head of cattle sold in Cheyenne for $12 a head, but the railroad manifest tucked in the back page shows 70 head loaded. Where did the money for the other 20 go?" Jedediah finally turned, his eyes flashing with defensive anger. He stalked over to the desk, slamming a heavy hand down next to the book. "And what does a city cook know about cattle prices? You've been here 3 weeks, Hattie. You bake good biscuits, but that don't make you the boss of this outfit." Hattie stood up. She was a foot shorter than him, but she squared her broad shoulders, meeting his furious gaze without flinching. "It makes me someone who can do math, Jedediah. Gentry is starving this ranch. He orders cheap, rotted grain and bills you for the premium. He sells your beef and pockets the difference. And I would wager my last dollar he's doing it on behalf of Bartholomew Finch." The mention of Finch's name made Jedediah flinch. A raw nerve struck. Finch was a vulture circling the valley, and Jedediah was deeply in debt to the Laramie Bank. If he missed the winter payment, Finch would buy the note and seize the Broken Anvil. Before Jedediah could argue further, the study door banged open. Wyatt stood there, soaked to the bone, his chest heaving, water pooling at his boots. "Boss," Wyatt gasped, his eyes wide with panic. "It's Gentry. He's down at the Eastern holding pens. He's cutting the wire. He's got 5 riders with him, and they're driving the breeding heifers out toward Finch's property line." Jedediah's face drained of color, the betrayal hitting him like a physical blow. He looked down at the ledger, then at Hattie. The realization that she had been right, that he had been a fool, washed over him. Without a word, Jedediah grabbed his Winchester rifle from the wall rack. He threw on his oilskin coat and stormed past Wyatt into the blinding rain. "Stay here," Jedediah roared at Hattie over his shoulder. But Hattie Coulter was not a woman who stayed put. She knew that men like Gentry did not cut fences without being prepared to kill whoever tried to stop them. She grabbed a lantern and a heavy woolen blanket, hurrying out into the storm behind Wyatt. The rain turned the ranch yard into a treacherous sea of mud. By the time Hattie reached the ridge overlooking the eastern pens, the confrontation had already erupted into chaos. Through the strobe light flashes of lightning, Hattie could see the massive shapes of the panicked heifers stampeding through the cut wire. Jedediah was on horseback, roaring orders at Thaddeus and Wyatt as they tried to turn the herd. Amos Gentry and his hired guns sat on horseback just beyond the fence line. "It's over, Jed," Gentry yelled over the thunder, pulling a revolver from his holster. "Finch owns this valley now. You're just too stubborn to die." Jedediah spurred his horse forward, raising his Winchester. "You thieving coward!" Gunfire erupted, the cracks sharp and deafening against the storm. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness. Hattie watched in horror as one of Gentry's men fired a shotgun. The blast spooked Jedediah's horse. The animal reared violently, screaming in terror. Jedediah was thrown from the saddle. As he hit the ground, Gentry took deliberate aim and fired his revolver. Hattie screamed as Jedediah's body jerked, his hands flying to his upper thigh. He collapsed into the mud, his rifle sliding out of reach. Gentry spurred his horse, preparing to ride over the wounded mountain man and finish the job. "No," Hattie bellowed. She didn't think, she just moved. Despite her heavy frame, adrenaline propelled her down the muddy slope. She swung the heavy glass and iron lantern she carried with all her might, hurling it directly at Gentry's approaching horse. The lantern shattered against a fence post right in front of the animal, igniting a flash of kerosene flames that hissed violently in the rain. The horse balked, rearing up and nearly throwing Gentry. Thaddeus and Wyatt, rallying at Hattie's distraction, opened fire on the rustlers. Outnumbered and having lost their element of surprise, Gentry cursed, hauling hard on his reins. "This ain't over, McAllister," Gentry shouted, turning his horse. "Finch is coming for the rest of it." The thieves galloped away into the darkness, abandoning the herd. Hattie fell to her knees in the mud next to Jedediah. The rain was washing the blood from his leg in a terrifying, steady stream. The bullet had caught him deep in the thigh, dangerously close to the femoral artery. He was pale, his teeth gritted in agonizing pain. "Boss," Wyatt cried, dropping to his knees on the other side, his hands shaking. "He's bleeding bad, Hattie. He's dying." "He is not dying today," Hattie snapped, her voice cutting through the panic like a knife. Her hands, usually so gentle when kneading dough, were firm and unyielding as she ripped the hem of her thick skirt. She pressed the wadded fabric directly into the wound. Jedediah roared in pain, trying to push her away. "Hold him down, Wyatt," Hattie commanded. "Thaddeus, get the wagon, now!" It took the three of them to heave Jedediah's massive frame into the back of the wagon. Hattie rode in the back, her heavy body bracing Jedediah as the wagon slammed over the rutted, muddy tracks back to the main house. She kept her hands pressed ruthlessly against his bleeding leg, her clothes soaked in mud and his blood. Jedediah looked up at her through half-closed, pain-clouded eyes. The rain plastered her hair to her face, but she looked like an avenging angel carved from stone. I was wrong," Jedediah managed to choke out, shivering violently from shock and the freezing rain. "Save your breath, Mr. McAllister," Hattie said sternly. "You're going to need it." They carried him into the main house, laying him on the heavy dining table. The men stood around helplessly, terrified of losing their leader, the man who held the fragile ranch together. Hattie stripped off her ruined coat and turned to the men. The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. She was no longer just the cook. "Wyatt, boil water, lots of it," Hattie ordered, pointing to the stove. "Thaddeus, fetch my valise from the barn. There is a bottle of carbolic acid and clean linens in it. Jim, get whiskey and the fire tongs." The men scrambled to obey her without a second thought. For the next 2 hours, the dining room became a surgery. Hattie poured whiskey over Jedediah's wound and down his throat. She used the heated tongs to fish out the deformed lead bullet lodged against his bone, ignoring his agonizing screams. When the bleeding wouldn't stop, she packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow and spiderwebs. She demanded Thaddeus fetch from the cellar rafters an old trick she had learned from a desperate doctor during a cholera outbreak back east. Finally, she stitched the torn flesh with heavy black thread. By midnight, the storm outside had settled into a cold, steady drizzle. Jedediah was unconscious, pale but breathing steadily. The bleeding had stopped. Hattie sat in a wooden chair beside him, her hands stained with dried blood, her back aching furiously. The men were gathered in the doorway, looking at her with a mixture of awe and absolute devotion. Thaddeus stepped forward, twisting his hat in his hands. "He gonna make it, Miss Hattie?" "He has a fever, but he is strong," Hattie said softly, wiping Jedediah's brow with a damp cloth. "He will live." "Gentry took 20 head, Wyatt said bitterly, staring at the floor. "But we saved the rest. Winter's coming fast, Hattie. Boss can't ride for weeks. Gentry knows it. Finch knows it. What are we gonna do?" Hattie looked at the wounded mountain man. Jedediah McAllister was incapacitated. The ranch had no foreman, a target on its back, and a brutal Wyoming winter bearing down on them. If they didn't organize, Finch would just walk in and take the land. Hattie stood up. The fatigue in her bones was overwhelming, but the fire in her chest burned brighter. She had lost her home in Philadelphia. She refused to lose this one. "Thaddeus," Hattie said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "Tomorrow at dawn, we move the remaining herd to the South Canyon. It's sheltered from the snow and easier to defend." But who's giving the orders?" Wyatt stammered. Hattie looked down at the ledger still sitting on the desk, then at the men who had come to depend on her for their daily bread. "Until Mr. McAllister is back on his feet," Hattie said, her gaze sweeping the room. "I am." "And Thaddeus?" "Yes, ma'am." "Go to the barn and fetch my cot," Hattie said, looking down at Jedediah's sleeping face. "I am sleeping in the house now." The first snow of 1,883 fell 2 days after the shootout, dusting the Wind River Valley in a deceptively peaceful layer of white. Inside the main house of the Broken Anvil, the air was thick with the scent of simmering bone broth, roasted garlic, and the sharp tang of carbolic acid. Jedediah McAllister survived the fever, but the wound left him bedridden and furious. For a man who had carved his life out of the unforgiving Wyoming granite, relying on others was a bitter pill. But every time he tried to rise, his leg betrayed him, leaving him gasping in agony. And every time he fell back against the pillows, Hattie was there. She did not coddle him. She did not pity him. She brought him hearty stews thickened with barley and wild mushrooms, commanding him to eat with the same authority she used to direct his men. And direct them she did. From his bedroom window, Jedediah watched a miracle unfold. Hattie had transformed his ragtag, dispirited crew into a disciplined unit. Under her orders, Thaddeus and Wyatt had successfully moved the remaining herd into the South Canyon, fortifying the narrow pass with felled timber and brush. She organized shifts, ensuring the men were always fed hot meals, spicy chili, thick slabs of cornbread, and roasted venison before they rode out into the freezing wind. Morale, which should have shattered with Jedediah's injury, was instead soaring. The men fought the winter, and the looming threat of rustlers not out of fear of their boss, but out of fierce loyalty to the woman who sustained them. One evening, as the wind howled outside, Hattie sat by Jedediah's bedside, mending a torn winter coat. The golden light of the kerosene lamp caught the strong, determined lines of her face. Jedediah watched her, the silence between them heavy but no longer hostile. "They listen to you," Jedediah said, his voice a low rasp. Hattie didn't look up from her needlework. "They listen to a full stomach, Mr. McAllister, and they listen to reason. I simply provide both." Jedediah shifted, wincing as a spike of pain shot through his thigh. "I judged you the second you stepped off that stagecoach. I looked at your size, and I saw a liability. I was a fool." Hattie finally stopped stitching. She looked at the hardened mountain man, seeing past the gruff exterior to the vulnerability he was finally allowing her to witness. Back in Philadelphia, men had ignored her, insulted her, or used her father's debt to mock her. Jedediah had done the same at first, but here, in the harsh truth of the frontier, he was acknowledging his error. "You were a product of your environment, Jedediah," Hattie said softly, dropping the formalities. "Out here, weakness is fatal. But you mistook physical form for inner strength. I have survived things that would have broken a lesser woman. A harsh word and a drafty barn were never going to defeat me." Jedediah reached out, his calloused, scarred hand covering her plump, capable one. The touch sent an unexpected jolt through Hattie's chest. "You're the strongest person on this ranch, Hattie, and I owe you my life." Before she could respond, the heavy wooden door of the house burst open. Wyatt stood in the entryway, snow clinging to his coat, his chest heaving. "They're coming!" Wyatt gasped. Thaddeus spotted them from the ridge. "It's Finch. He's got Gentry and a dozen hired guns with him. They're riding straight for the main house." Jedediah's grip on Hattie's hand tightened. He tried to throw off the blankets, reaching for the Winchester leaning against the nightstand. "Hand me my rifle." "You can't even stand, Jedediah," Hattie argued, pushing his shoulders back down. "I ain't letting Bartholomew Finch take this land while I hide in a bed," Jedediah roared, his pride flaring. Hattie's eyes flashed with a sudden, fierce brilliance. "Finch isn't here for a gunfight, Jedediah. If he wanted to kill us all, he would have ambushed the men in the canyon. He's here to take the ranch legally, knowing you're crippled and vulnerable. He wants the deed." Hattie turned away from the bed and walked over to the heavy oak desk in the corner of the room. She opened the bottom drawer and pulled out the forged ledger she had found weeks ago, along with a thick envelope. "Wyatt," Hattie commanded. "Tell the men to stay out of sight, but keep their rifles trained on the porch. Do not fire unless I give the signal." "Hattie, what are you doing?" Jedediah demanded, his heart hammering with sudden terror for her safety. Hattie turned to him, a cold, confident smile playing on her lips. "I am going to do what I do best, Jedediah. I am going to balance the books." The storm had temporarily broken, leaving the ranch yard bathed in the eerie blue light of a full winter moon. Bartholomew Finch, a wealthy, sharply dressed man in a beaver pelt coat, rode into the yard flanked by Amos Gentry and 12 heavily armed men. They halted their horses at the edge of the porch, the steam from the animals' breath pluming in the freezing air. Finch looked at the quiet house, a smug, victorious smile on his face. He expected to find a dying rancher and a terrified crew. Instead, the front door opened and Henrietta Coulter stepped out onto the porch. She wore a heavy buffalo hide coat over her dress, and in the crook of her arm, she casually held a double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun. She did not look afraid. She looked like a mountain. "Where's McAllister?" Gentry sneered, resting his hand on his revolver. "Did the boss finally bleed out?" "Mr. McAllister is resting," Hattie said, her voice carrying clearly across the snow. "I am managing the Broken Anvil's affairs. State your business and get off my yard." Finch let out a dry, condescending laugh. He nudged his horse a step forward. "My business is with the owner, not the cook. But since you're playing house, you can deliver a message. McAllister missed his winter payment to the Laramie Bank. I bought the note. The debt is called in full. Since he can't pay, I'm seizing the property. Tell him to sign the deed over by morning, or my men will clear this house by force." Hattie didn't blink. With her free hand, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the forged ledger and the thick envelope. She tossed them onto the snow-covered ground at Finch's horse's hooves. "I wouldn't be so hasty regarding legalities, Mr. Finch," Hattie said smoothly. "Before the snows closed the northern pass, I sent Thaddeus on a very specific errand to Cheyenne. He delivered a package to U.S. Marshal Harrison Caldwell." Finch's smug smile faltered. Gentry shifted uneasily in his saddle. "What are you talking about, woman?" Finch snapped. "I am talking about interstate rustling, fraud, and conspiracy," Hattie declared, her voice ringing like a bell. "That ledger contains the altered books Amos Gentry kept for this ranch. The envelope contains the actual railroad manifests from Cheyenne. Gentry was selling McAllister beef under your brand, Mr. Finch. Shipping stolen cattle across state lines is a federal offense. Marshal Caldwell's deputies are riding from Laramie as we speak, with federal warrants for both of your arrests." The silence that followed was deafening, save for the howling wind. Finch stared at the obese woman on the porch, realizing with dawning horror that he had been completely outmaneuvered by a cook. Gentry panicked. Knowing he was facing the hangman's noose, he drew his revolver, aiming straight for Hattie's chest. "You lying bitch!" Before Gentry could pull the trigger, the front window of the house shattered outward. Jedediah McAllister, propped up on a crutch and pale as a ghost, thrust his Winchester through the broken glass. He fired a single, deafening shot. The bullet shattered Gentry's wrist. The foreman screamed, dropping his gun into the snow and clutching his mangled arm. From the darkness of the barn and the bunkhouse, the distinct clack-clack of lever-action rifles echoed into the night. Wyatt, Thaddeus, and the rest of the crew stepped out of the shadows, their weapons trained squarely on Finch's posse. "You're trespassing, Finch," Jedediah's gravelly voice echoed from the window. "And my manager just asked you to leave." Finch looked at the bleeding Gentry, then at the ring of rifles surrounding him. He was a businessman, not a martyr. He spurred his horse backward. "This isn't over, McAllister." "Yes, it is," Hattie replied coldly. "If you ever set foot in this valley again, I will personally see that the marshal receives the rest of the evidence I kept hidden. Ride." Defeated and humiliated, Finch signaled his men. They turned their horses and fled into the dark, dragging the whimpering Gentry with them. The siege of the Broken Anvil was over. By the spring of 1884, the valley was lush and green. The cattle in the South Canyon had survived the winter, fetching a premium price in Laramie. With the threat of Finch gone and the traitorous foreman removed, the ranch flourished. Hattie stood in the bustling kitchen, pulling a massive golden-brown peach cobbler from the oven. The men outside were laughing as they loaded a wagon. Strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind. Jedediah, walking with only a slight limp now, rested his chin on her shoulder, breathing in the sweet scent of cinnamon and peaches. "You're going to make me too fat to ride a horse, Hattie," Jedediah murmured, kissing her cheek. Hattie leaned back against his broad chest, smiling as she set the cast-iron pan on the counter. "If you get too big for a horse, Jedediah, I suppose you'll just have to stay in the kitchen with me." He turned her around, his calloused hands gently cupping her face. The harsh mountain man who had once banished her to the barn was gone, replaced by a man who looked at her as if she hung the stars in the Wyoming sky. "I'd sleep in the barn for the rest of my life," Jedediah whispered, his eyes filled with absolute devotion, "if it meant waking up next to you." He kissed her, sweet and deep, proving that the most enduring things in the Wild West weren't built with bullets or blood, but with unyielding grit, a warm hearth, and a love that could weather any storm. Did Hattie's brilliant strategy and unyielding spirit capture your heart? If you loved this tale of frontier survival, delicious revenge, and a romance that defied all odds, please hit that like button. Share this incredible real-life inspired story with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling Wild West dramas and unforgettable pioneer romances. Leave a comment below. Would you have survived the Broken Anvil? See you in the next video.
Hi, my name is Prairie Rose, the owner and manager of Obese Girl, Oregon. After watching the video, "You'll sleep in the barn," the mountain man said, "until her cooking saved his ranch." I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? For me, this story was a gentle reminder that kindness, determination, and everyday talents can change the way people see one another. Sometimes, the biggest difference comes from simple actions that are easy to overlook at first. What part of the story stayed with you the longest, and why? Have you ever seen someone's opinion change after they were given a fair chance? Maybe this story encourages us to look beyond first impressions and appreciate what each person brings to the table. If it meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoy stories like this, feel free to like or subscribe.